The screaming engine noise grew louder, and able Seaman Ken Gordon, 22 years old, stationed at the Port Beaufort's anti-aircraft gun aboard HMNZS Gambia, had 4 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether he and 60 men around him would die in a fireball of twisted metal and burning aviation fuel. The Japanese Zero fighter was diving at 300 kilometers per hour, directly toward the cruiser's superstructure. The pilot already committed to dying, his aircraft loaded with 250 kilograms of explosives, and Ken's hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the gun's controls, because this was the 3rd kamikaze attack in 6 hours, and every single one that penetrated the defensive screen meant instant death for everyone within 30 meters of impact. Ken came from a sheep farming family in Gisborne, New Zealand, a place so far from the ocean that the first time he saw the sea was the day he boarded a train to Auckland to enlist in the Royal New Zealand Navy in 1943. His father had fought at Gallipoli in World War I and told him that war was about surviving long enough to come home, about keeping your head down and your wits sharp. But nothing his father said prepared him for this. Facing an enemy who did not want to survive, who measured success not by living, but by dying while taking you with him. In Ken's locker below deck sat a photograph of Margaret, his girlfriend from Gisborne, and a letter she had written 3 months ago that ended with the words, "Come home safe, Ken. We have our whole lives ahead of us." And now, with the kamikaze's propeller filling his vision and the sound of the engine screaming like something from hell itself, those words felt like the cruelest promise ever made. The Gambia was a Colony-class light cruiser, 169 meters of steel and firepower, commissioned into the Royal New Zealand Navy in September 1943, and immediately assigned to the British Pacific Fleet to fight alongside British, Australian, and American forces in the final push against Japan. She carried a crew of 730 men, most of them young New Zealanders who had never been more than 50 kilometers from their hometowns before the war. Farmers and shop clerks and teachers who learned to load 5-inch guns and track enemy aircraft on radar screens, and sleep in hammocks that swung violently every time the ship's engines changed speed. Ken had joined the crew in Auckland in February 1945, just 3 weeks before the Gambia sailed north to join Task Force 57, the designation the Americans gave to the British Pacific Fleet. And in the 5 months since then, he had seen more death and destruction than he thought existed in the entire world. By July 1945, the war in the Pacific had reached its final, most desperate phase. American forces had captured Okinawa after 82 days of the bloodiest fighting in the Pacific campaign. And now the Allied fleets were positioned directly off the coast of mainland Japan, conducting daily bombardments and airstrikes against Japanese cities and military installations. The Japanese military, facing certain defeat, had fully committed to kamikaze tactics, suicide attacks by pilots who deliberately crashed explosive-laden aircraft into Allied ships. Between April and August 1945, approximately 2,800 kamikaze attacks sank 34 Allied ships, damaged 368 others, killed 4,900 sailors, and wounded another 4,800. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the physical casualties, because every man on every ship knew that traditional naval combat tactics meant nothing against an enemy who treated death not as a risk to be avoided, but as a mission objective to be achieved. Ken had experienced his first kamikaze attack on April 9, 1945, during operations off the Sakishima Islands, a group of Japanese-held islands between Okinawa and Formosa. The Gambia and her sister ship HMNZS Achilles were screening British aircraft carriers that were launching strikes against Japanese airfields, and Ken was below deck in the mess when the alarm bells started ringing, and the voice over the ship's intercom system shouted, air raid, all hands to action stations, this is not a drill." He ran up 3 sets of ladders in 15 seconds, his heart pounding, his mouth dry, and reached his position at the Port Beaufort's gun just as the first Japanese aircraft broke through the clouds at 2,000 meters altitude. The gun captain, a New Zealander named Thompson who had been a carpenter before the war, grabbed Ken's shoulder and said, "Don't think about it, just aim and fire. If you hesitate, we're all dead." And Ken nodded because there was nothing else to say. The Beaufort's 40mm gun was designed to fire 120 rounds per minute, each shell weighing nearly 1 kilogram and traveling at 850 meters per second. Ken's job was to feed ammunition clips into the gun, while Thompson tracked targets, and another crewman operated the firing mechanism. The first Kamikaze came in low and fast, skimming the wave tops to avoid radar detection, and Ken saw it clearly. A Mitsubishi Zero with the rising sun painted on its fuselage and smoke trailing from its engine. Thompson swung the gun around, locked onto the target, and the gun began firing, the recoil slamming into Ken's shoulder through the ammunition feed mechanism, spent shell casings raining down around his feet. The tracer rounds arced across the sky in bright yellow streams, and Ken saw some of them strike the Zero's wing, tearing chunks of metal away. But the plane kept coming, kept diving, and for 3 seconds Ken was absolutely certain it would hit the Gambia and they would all die. At the last possible moment, the Zero's left wing disintegrated completely. The aircraft rolled sideways, and it plunged into the ocean 70 meters from the ship's port side, exploding in a geyser of white water and black smoke. Ken realized he had been holding his breath and gasped for air, his hands trembling, but Thompson was already yelling, "Reload! Reload! There's more coming!" And Ken looked up to see 4 more aircraft approaching from different angles, the sky filled with anti-aircraft fire from the Gambia and the other ships in the task force, streams of tracers crisscrossing like deadly fireworks, and the noise was so loud Ken felt it in his chest, a physical pressure that made his ribs vibrate. 2 more Kamikazes were shot down before reaching the fleet. One simply disintegrated in midair when a 5-inch shell from the Gambia's main battery struck it dead center, but the 4th aircraft made it through. Ken watched in horror as the Kamikaze, trailing flames from both wings, crashed directly into the flight deck of HMS Formidable, one of the British aircraft carriers the Gambia was supposed to be protecting. The explosion was massive, a ball of orange fire that rose 50 meters into the air, and even from 3 kilometers away Ken could feel the heat on his face. Black smoke poured from the carrier's deck, and for a moment Ken thought the ship was doomed. But then he saw firefighting crews running toward the blaze, and the carrier's engines were still running, still maintaining formation. Thompson said quietly, "Armored flight deck. British carriers have armored flight decks. American carriers don't. That's why we're still in this fight." And Ken understood for the first time that the Gambia's mission was not just to shoot down enemy aircraft, but to absorb attacks that would otherwise destroy the carriers. That night, lying in his hammock with his ears still ringing from the gunfire, Ken tried to write a letter to Margaret, but could not find the words to describe what he had experienced. How could he explain that he had spent 6 hours watching young men his own age, Japanese pilots barely out of their teens, deliberately fly to their deaths? How could he make her understand the sick feeling in his stomach when he successfully shot down a Kamikaze, knowing that his marksmanship had killed someone who was already committed to dying? He put the pencil down and stared at the steel ceiling above him, listening to the sound of the ship's engines and the breathing of 600 other men who were all thinking similar thoughts, and eventually exhaustion dragged him into a fitful sleep, filled with nightmares of burning aircraft and screaming engines. The Kamikaze attacks continued for weeks. On April 13th, during another raid, the Gambia's gun crews were so focused on tracking incoming Japanese aircraft that they accidentally shot down an American F-6F Hellcat fighter that had strayed into their firing zone. Ken was not on the gun that fired the fatal shots, but he saw the American plane spinning into the ocean, smoke pouring from its engine, and he saw the pilot eject and deploy his parachute, and the knowledge that friendly fire could kill you just as dead as enemy action added another layer of terror to an already nightmarish situation. The American pilot was rescued by a destroyer, suffering only minor injuries, but the incident haunted Ken for days because it proved that in the chaos of combat, when dozens of aircraft were diving and guns were firing in every direction, mistakes were inevitable, and the line between heroism and tragedy was measured in fractions of a second. By May, the British Pacific Fleet had been at sea for 62 continuous days, and the Gambia's boilers were showing signs of serious wear. The ship returned to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines for emergency repairs and resupply, and Ken finally had a chance to go ashore and walk on solid ground that did not pitch and roll with every wave. The Americans had established a massive forward base at Leyte, with hundreds of ships anchored in the harbor, and supply depots stretching for kilometers along the shore. And Ken was struck by the sheer scale of the Allied war effort. He met an American sailor from a destroyer that had been hit by a kamikaze off Okinawa, and the man showed him photographs of his ship. The entire superstructure melted into twisted metal, the deck peeled back like a tin can, and 43 of his shipmates dead. The American said, "You guys on the cruisers and battleships, you got armor and big guns, you got a fighting chance. But us on the destroyers and destroyer escorts, we're just targets. We can't take a hit and survive." And Ken realized that however terrifying his experience had been, there were men facing even worse odds every single day. On July 16, 1945, the Gambia and the rest of Task Force 37, as the British Pacific Fleet had been redesignated, began operations directly off the coast of mainland Japan. The mission was to conduct naval bombardments of Japanese cities and industrial facilities, while simultaneously defending the fleet's aircraft carriers from kamikaze attacks. Ken stood on deck as the Gambia steamed north toward Japan, and he could see the Japanese coastline in the distance, mountains rising from the sea, and it felt surreal to be this close to enemy territory, to be within sight of the nation that had started this war, and was now refusing to surrender even though defeat was inevitable. On July 31st, the Gambia and HMNZS Achilles were detached from the main task force to meet up with the fleet train, a group of supply ships that would refuel and resupply the cruisers for continued operations. Ken's watch schedule had him on duty at the Beaufort's gun from 1400 hours to 1800 hours, and the day was hot and humid, the kind of oppressive tropical heat that made sweat pour down his face and soaked his uniform within minutes. At 15:20, the alarm bells started ringing again, and Ken's stomach clenched because he knew what was coming, even before the intercom announcement. Air raid, multiple bogies inbound from bearing 090. All gun crews to action stations. Thompson was already at the gun when Ken arrived, scanning the eastern horizon with binoculars, and he said, "There, 3 o'clock high, coming out of the sun." And Ken looked up and saw them. 5 Japanese aircraft in loose formation, about 4,000 meters out and closing fast. The Gambia's main battery opened fire first, 5-inch shells bursting in the air around the incoming aircraft, creating black clouds of shrapnel that forced the Japanese planes to break formation. 2 of the kamikazes turned away, either damaged or deciding to find easier targets. But 3 continued their attack runs, diving toward the Gambia and Achilles. The Beaufort's gun began firing, and Ken fell into the rhythm he had practiced 100 times. Lift the ammunition clip, slot it into the feed mechanism, wait for the clip to empty, eject the spent clip, load the next one, repeat. Tracer rounds filled the air. The noise was deafening, and Ken focused on his task because if he allowed himself to think about the kamikaze diving toward them at 400 kilometers per hour, he would freeze, and if he froze, they would all die. Thompson was shouting corrections. Up 2 degrees, left, steady, fire, 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 and the gun tracked the nearest 0, pouring shells into the sky. The first kamikaze disintegrated 200 meters from the ship, hit by concentrated fire from at least 3 different gun positions, and pieces of the aircraft rained down into the ocean. The second kamikaze rolled inverted and plunged into the sea off the Achilles' starboard side, so close that the explosion sent water cascading across the cruiser's deck. But the third kamikaze, trailing smoke from its engine and with part of its tail shot away, kept coming, kept diving, aimed directly at the Gambia's bridge where Captain Ralph Edwards and his command staff were directing the ship's defense. Ken's gun was firing non-stop, the barrel glowing red-hot, and he could see their shells hitting the kamikaze, punching holes in the fuselage, tearing away pieces of the wing. But the aircraft would not stop, would not fall, and in that moment Ken understood the true horror of kamikaze tactics. The pilot was already dead in every way that mattered. His body just had not stopped functioning yet, and nothing short of complete destruction would prevent him from completing his mission. Thompson was screaming, "Hit him, hit him, hit him!" And Ken loaded another clip. The gun fired, and this time Ken saw the Zero's cockpit shatter, saw the propeller break away, saw the aircraft lose all control and cartwheel sideways just 50 meters from the Gambia's superstructure. The Kamikaze hit the water directly alongside the ship, so close that the explosion showered the deck with seawater and shrapnel peppered the hull, and Ken felt the Gambia shudder from the impact. Men were cheering, shouting that they got him, but Ken just stood there shaking, staring at the burning wreckage floating past the ship, and he thought about the Japanese pilot in that cockpit, thought about what his last seconds must have been like, knowing he had failed, knowing he would die without taking any enemies with him, and Ken felt sick. Thompson put a hand on Ken's shoulder and said, "You did good, Gordon. You kept loading no matter what. That's what saved us." But Ken could not respond because his hands were trembling so badly he could not control them, and there was a ringing in his ears that would not stop. Another crewman brought water, and Ken drank it mechanically, tasting nothing. And someone said the all-clear had been sounded and they could stand down from action stations. And Ken's legs almost gave out when he tried to walk because the adrenaline that had been keeping him upright was draining away and leaving him hollow. That night in his hammock, Ken did something he had not done since he was a child. He cried, not from fear, though he was terrified, and not from relief at having survived, though he was grateful, but from the overwhelming weight of what he had experienced, from the knowledge that war had transformed him into someone who measured success by how efficiently he could kill other human beings, even human beings who wanted to die. He thought about Margaret waiting for him in Gisborne, thought about the sheep farm where he had grown up, thought about a world where the worst thing that could happen in a day was a broken fence or a sick lamb, and that world seemed impossibly distant, like something from someone else's life. On August 9th, 1945, the Gambia participated in the bombardment of Kamikaze, a Japanese city on the northeastern coast of Honshu that housed major steel and iron production facilities. Ken watched from his gun position as the ship's main battery fired salvo after salvo into the city, 5-inch shells arcing through the air and exploding among the industrial buildings and warehouses. The bombardment lasted for 2 hours, and by the end, the entire industrial complex was engulfed in flames, black smoke rising thousands of meters into the air. Allied intelligence later determined that the attack had destroyed hundreds of tons of pig iron and damaged critical manufacturing infrastructure. But Ken knew the bombardment had also destroyed 1,471 houses and killed 281 Japanese civilians, and he wondered if any of them had families, if any of them had people waiting for them to come home. The Gambia fired the final shots of the bombardment, the last shells leaving the guns at 17:30 hours. And then the ship turned away from the burning city and rejoined the task force. That night, rumors began spreading through the ship that something significant had happened, that the Americans had dropped a new type of bomb on Japan, something called an atomic bomb that had destroyed an entire city in a single explosion. Ken did not know if the rumors were true, but he hoped they were because if this new weapon could end the war, then maybe he would get to go home. Maybe he would get to see Margaret again. Maybe he could try to become the person he used to be before the war taught him how to kill. On August 15th, at 0300 hours, the Gambia received a message from Fleet Headquarters. Japan had agreed to surrender unconditionally. The war was over. All offensive operations were to cease immediately. Ken was asleep when the news came through, and he was woken by cheering echoing through the ship, men shouting and laughing and crying with relief. He climbed out of his hammock and joined the celebration on deck, shaking hands with crewmates he barely knew. And everyone was smiling, but there was also a stunned quality to the celebration, a sense that they could not quite believe they had survived, that they were going to get to go home. But the war was not finished with Ken Gordon yet. At 0700 hours on August 15th, just 4 hours after the ceasefire announcement, Ken was back at his gun position during a routine patrol when the alarm bells started ringing again. Thompson looked at him in disbelief and said, What the hell, the war's over, why are we at action stations? But Ken was already loading ammunition, because his body had learned to respond to the alarm before his mind could process what was happening. The intercom crackled, and Captain Edwards' voice came through, steady and calm. All hands. We have multiple unidentified aircraft approaching from the north. It appears some Japanese pilots have not received the ceasefire order or are choosing to ignore it. All gun crews engage as necessary. Ken felt a surge of anger so intense it startled him. The war was over, Japan had surrendered, and these pilots were still attacking, still trying to kill, still willing to die for a cause that had already been lost. The kamikazes came in fast and low, 4 aircraft spread out across a 2-kilometer front, and every gun on the Gambia and the surrounding ships opened fire simultaneously. The sky erupted in anti-aircraft fire, more intense than anything Ken had seen before, as if every gunner in the fleet was channeling months of fear and exhaustion and rage into this final desperate battle. 3 of the kamikazes were destroyed almost instantly, torn apart by the sheer volume of fire. But the 4th aircraft, a twin-engine bomber, broke through the defensive screen and dove toward the task force. Ken's gun tracked the bomber, firing continuously, and he could see his shells hitting the aircraft's fuselage, could see pieces of metal breaking away. But the bomber was larger and more robust than the Zero fighters, and it absorbed the damage and kept coming. Thompson was shouting range corrections. Other guns were firing. The noise was apocalyptic, and the bomber was 200 meters away, then 100, then 50, and Ken knew with absolute certainty that this was it. This was how he would die, killed by an enemy who refused to acknowledge that the war had ended. The bomber's left engine exploded, hit by a 5-inch shell from another ship in the task force, and the aircraft rolled sharply to port, losing altitude rapidly, and it plunged into the ocean 30 meters from the Gambia's starboard side, the explosion sending a column of water 50 meters into the air. Ken stood at his gun, ammunition clip in his hands, breathing hard, and he realized his face was wet, and he did not know if it was seawater from the explosion or tears or sweat. Thompson said softly, "That was the last one, Gordon. That was the last kamikaze of the war, and we shot the bastard down." And Ken nodded but could not speak because his throat was tight and his hands were shaking again. Captain Edwards came over the intercom. "Ceasefire, ceasefire, all guns ceasefire. The engagement is over." And the sudden silence was so profound that Ken's ears rang in the absence of gunfire. Later, historians would confirm that the shots fired by the Gambia and the other ships in Task Force 37 during that final engagement on August 15, 1945, were among the very last shots fired in World War II, the final violent act of a conflict that had killed more than 70 million people worldwide. Ken Gordon and his crewmates had the dubious distinction of fighting in the war's final battle, proving that even surrender and ceasefire announcements could not instantly transform warriors back into ordinary men. On September 2, 1945, the Gambia steamed into Tokyo Bay and anchored alongside hundreds of other Allied warships for the formal Japanese surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri. Ken stood on deck with the rest of the crew, wearing his dress uniform, and watched as Japanese officials in formal clothing climbed the stairs to the Missouri's deck, where General Douglas MacArthur and representatives from the Allied nations waited. The ceremony lasted 30 minutes, speeches and document signings and photographs, and when it was over, Japan was officially defeated, and World War II had ended. Ken felt nothing. He had expected to feel relief or joy or triumph, but instead he just felt empty, hollowed out, as if the war had burned away everything inside him and left only a shell. Thompson stood beside him and said, "We're going home, mate. Back to New Zealand, back to our families." And Ken said, "Yeah, because what else was there to say?" The Gambia remained in Japanese waters for several weeks, participating in the repatriation of Allied prisoners of war who had been held in Japanese prison camps. Ken saw some of these men as they were brought aboard for transport, and they looked like walking skeletons, their eyes sunken and haunted, and Ken understood that his experience of the war, as terrible as it had been, was nothing compared to what these men had endured. One former prisoner, an Australian soldier who had been captured in Singapore in 1942, and spent 3.5 years in captivity, shook Ken's hand and said, "Thank you for coming to get us. We thought everyone had forgotten we existed." And Ken said, "We never forgot, mate. We never stopped fighting to get you home." And for the first time since the war ended, Ken felt something that might have been pride. On October 11, 1945, the Gambia departed Japan for the voyage home to New Zealand. The journey took 19 days, and Ken spent most of it on deck, staring at the ocean, trying to process everything that had happened. The ship arrived in Auckland on October 30th to a massive welcome. Thousands of people lining the harbor, bands playing, flags waving, and families searching the crowded decks for their sons and husbands and brothers. Ken saw Margaret before she saw him, standing near the front of the crowd wearing a yellow dress he recognized from the photograph in his locker, and when their eyes met, she started crying, and so did he. They married 6 weeks later in a small church in Gisborne, the same church where Margaret had written that letter promising they would have their whole lives together. Ken wore his naval dress uniform, and Margaret wore white lace, and during the ceremony Ken's hand shook so badly he could barely slip the ring onto her finger, and later he would tell her it was because he was nervous, but really it was because his hands had not stopped shaking since that day in July, when he loaded ammunition clips while a kamikaze dove toward his ship. Ken Gordon left the Royal New Zealand Navy in February 1946 and returned to Gisborne, where he took over his father's sheep farm. He and Margaret had 4 children and 12 grandchildren, and on the surface he lived a quiet, unremarkable life, tending his flock and mending fences and watching the seasons change. But every night for the rest of his life he dreamed about kamikazes, about burning aircraft and screaming engines, and young men dying for a war that had already ended. He rarely spoke about his time on the Gambia, not because he was trying to forget, but because he did not have the words to make anyone understand what it had been like to face an enemy who measured victory not by survival, but by death. On ANZAC Day every year, he attended the dawn service in Gisborne, standing with other veterans in the cold pre-dawn darkness, and he thought about Thompson and the other men he had served with, and he wondered if they also still heard the alarm bells ringing in their sleep. In 2007, a historian from the New Zealand Navy Museum contacted Ken for an interview about his service on the Gambia. Ken was 84 years old by then, his hands gnarled with arthritis, and he sat in his living room and told the historian about the kamikazes and the bombardments, and the final battle on August 15th when the war was supposedly over. The historian asked Ken what he wanted people to remember about the Gambia and her crew, and Ken thought for a long time before answering. "I want them to remember that we were just ordinary blokes," he said finally. "Farm boys and shop workers and kids who had never been away from home before. We did not ask to face an enemy who wanted to die killing us. We did not ask to fire the last shots of the bloodiest war in human history. We just did our jobs, loaded the guns and fired the shells and tried to survive long enough to go home. And some of us did survive, and we got to have families and normal lives. But part of us never left that ship. Part of us is still standing at those gun positions, hands shaking, watching the sky for the next kamikaze, waiting for a war that ended 70 years ago to finally be over." Ken Gordon died in 2009 at the age of 86. His funeral was held in Gisborne, and among the mourners were 3 other Gambia veterans who traveled from across New Zealand to honor their former crewmate. They stood at attention as the coffin passed, these old men with tears on their faces, and one of them whispered, "Fair winds and following seas, mate. You held your position to the end." The HMNZS Gambia served in the Royal New Zealand Navy until 1946, when she was returned to the Royal Navy. She was eventually sold to India in 1948 and served as INS Delhi until being decommissioned in 1978. A small plaque on the ship's bridge commemorated her service as the vessel that fired some of the final shots of World War II. But most people who saw it did not understand what that meant, did not grasp the significance of being the last to fight in a war that should have ended hours earlier. Today, few people remember the Gambia or her crew. There are no movies about them, no monuments in their honor, no best-selling books recounting their experiences. But in Gisborne, New Zealand, There is a small exhibit at the local museum that includes Ken Gordon's naval uniform and a photograph of the Gambia at sea, and occasionally a visitor will stop and read the caption that explains this ordinary-looking man was part of an extraordinary moment in history. And if you listen carefully, if you stand in that quiet museum room and close your eyes, you can almost hear the alarm bells ringing, the guns firing, the kamikazes diving, and the voices of young men who faced an enemy that did not fear death and discovered that the truest courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to keep fighting even when you are terrified, even when the war is supposedly over, even when every instinct screams at you to run. Ken Gordon and the crew of HMNZS Gambia did not choose their place in history. They did not volunteer to fire the last shots of World War II. But when that moment came, when those final kamikazes attacked hours after the ceasefire, they stood at their guns and they did their duty, and they survived to tell a story that deserves to be remembered. Because forgetting them means forgetting what war actually costs. Not just the lives lost, but the parts of ourselves we sacrificed to survive, the innocence burned away in the fires of combat, the sleep stolen by nightmares that never end, and the price paid by ordinary people asked to do extraordinary things in the worst circumstances imaginable. That is the legacy of HMNZS Gambia and her crew. 730 ordinary men who became extraordinary not through superhuman courage, but through simple human endurance, who faced the unfaceable and survived to build lives and families and futures, even though part of them would always remain at those gun positions, hands shaking, eyes on the sky, waiting for the next attack that would never come. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the cost of war and the courage of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, please share it with others so that Ken Gordon and the crew of HMNZS Gambia are not forgotten. Leave a comment telling us what you think about these men who fired the last shots of World War II, and subscribe to this channel for more untold stories of courage, sacrifice, and the human cost of history's greatest conflicts.